Hey, it's Brandon Laws. Welcome to Transform Your Workplace. Before we get into today's conversation, a quick word about our sponsor, Xenium HR. If you're a leader at a growing company and HR feels like it's held together with duct tape, you're not alone. Xenium's custom HR support gives you access to experienced HR professionals who work alongside your team. Whether you need full outsourced HR or just some extra muscle behind your existing crew, they meet you exactly where you are. Learn more at xeniumhr.com. All right, today I am excited to welcome back Aoife O'Brien. You might remember her from about a year ago on the show, and since then she's been really busy. She just released a brand new book called Thriving Talent: How Great Leaders Drive Performance, Engagement, and Retention. Aoife spent 20 years in corporate roles. Some were great, some left her hollow, overlooked, and questioning everything. That experience sent her on a mission to figure out why so many workplaces fail the people inside them. She went back to school, earned a master's in organizational behavior, hosted over 200 conversations with business leaders on her podcast called Happier at Work, and she's built a practical framework that she's now used with blue chip clients to improve engagement and retention. So, in this episode, we talk about why engagement numbers haven't budged despite all the attention, why busyness is not the same as productivity, what's actually wrong with most workplace interventions, and how her thriving talent framework helps leaders create the conditions where people do their best work. Here are a few things you'll walk away with. 1, the difference between leading and lagging indicators of engagement and why most companies are measuring the wrong thing. 2, why psychological safety is the foundation of her framework, not leadership. And 3, how AI and technology are creating more work, not less, and what leaders should do about it. All right, let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Aoife O'Brien. Aoife, it is so good to have you back on the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Brandon. It's great to be back. I can't believe it's been so long since we spoke, but I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
That year went by fast. I was looking back. It was almost exactly a year ago. I had you on and I was on your show too. So glad to have you back on. And you're on for a special reason. You've got a new book that's out by the time this releases. It's called Thriving Talent: How Great Leaders Drive Performance, Engagement, and Retention. And early in the book, you cite Gallup's global research where they show that only 21% of people globally are engaged at work. You call that an astounding number, which I believe that is an astounding number. It's hard to actually believe that. With all the focus on engagement over the years, why hasn't this percentage increased over time?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm not sure that we're addressing the right issues. I think when we talk about things like engagement, and, I've talked about this on my podcast before, I think when we look at those things, they're more outcomes. We haven't necessarily looked at what are the underlying factors that drive those numbers. And so we're trying to oftentimes put a band-aid on something that really requires surgery, let's say, like some sort of deeper intervention into like what's actually going on here. So when I talk about thriving talent, it's really about creating the conditions where people can do their best work. So it's not focusing on, let's move the engagement number for the sake of moving the engagement number. That's the kind of language that leaders understand. But how do we actually create the environments? How do we take a step back and create the conditions where people feel really excited about their work? Because I think it's important. I've been in organizations where I felt really excited to go to work, and I've been in organizations where I haven't, that it's been quite toxic, or I'm just not really that interested in the role or the team that I'm working with. So I think we need to kind of take that step back and look at, well, what are some of those underlying things? And again, I go into more detail in the book on this, but I think one thing, just from conversations I've had about this topic, and a kind of a section on the book and conversations I've had on the podcast as well, this idea of feeling like we matter at work. feeling
Mm.
like the work that we do is actually important. I know Zach Mercurio talks an awful lot about that as well. I think it's something really important, but he talks about this idea, which I find really interesting, of the leading versus the lagging indicators. So lagging indicator would be something like engagement or happiness, whereas a leading indicator is how you feel about the work that you're actually doing.
You highlight busyness as one of those many things that are wrong with work, and you share that one of the most common greetings at work, which I recognize this all the time, is busy, you? And yeah, busy. And you reference Adam Grant's argument that busyness often signals inefficiency, not actually productivity. Whereas I think most people wear busyness as a badge of honor, like, look how productive I am, but it's actually not the case. So why do we keep confusing the two? And what is it costing us at work?
So I have so much to say about this. I'm so fascinated by this topic because I'm obviously not immune to that. I get sucked into this trap of feeling busy, feeling like I'm achieving something. I think, and again, like Dory Clark talks about this like really interestingly as well. When we feel busy, we feel like we're being productive because we're in action mode or actually doing something. And I think that's a trap that we fall into. Another thing to consider with that is we could be deliberately being busy to avoid something that we don't want to feel. So maybe you don't like your job, so you're burying your head in just getting stuff done. And we can feel really, really busy and keep doing stuff. And if I think about, myself, so how do I feel busy? Well, responding to emails. I have an email, I responded to it, and you can check at the end of the day how many emails you've responded to. Attending meetings makes us feel busy. Doing busy work, like just doing the administration around work rather than actual sitting down and doing proper deep work that's going to move things forward, that makes us feel busy. But, and this is, I mentioned before we started recording that I'm already thinking about what the next book will be. I think for me, one of the really important distinctions to make is the impact that we're having at work. So we may feel busy, but you may get to the end of the day and realize you haven't actually shifted anything of the projects that you're working on. You've felt really busy and you feel tired because you've been switching between lots of different tasks all day. But you get to the end of the day and what do you have to actually show for it? So I think it's really important, and it's a really difficult mindset shift to make, because it is a shift that we need to make to think about what impact are we having here. And if we take the bigger picture view, what I am doing on a day-to-day basis, I control what I do. I run my own business. So it's up to me to decide what that impact is and what I want to do. But if I'm working inside a business, it usually comes from my leader to say what my objectives are, or what's really important to work on, what is the number one priority. And if that leader is not clear or hasn't explained things very well to me, then I, as an individual, can get caught up in that busy trap of doing a lot of things, but they're not necessarily having the impact that I want to have for my career or that the business wants to have as well.
Besides busyness, what else is wrong with work these days?
Oh, I think we could
You
have an
highlight a bunch of
entire
stuff, so
podcast
maybe
episode
right.
about this. There's so many different things. I think, there's so many people who are not happy at work. They're not necessarily working to their strengths.
Yeah.
I think there's oh, it's like where do I even start? We could have an entire podcast episode just about this topic. So there's the idea that we're busy all the time. We're not really enjoying the work that we're doing. I think when we have leaders in place, they're not necessarily a positive influence for us. So again, I go into leadership in a bit more detail in the book, and I share examples of 3 really terrible bosses that I had, but also, some of the positive ones. But most people, when they step into that leadership position, they are not trained. So this is UK research rather than US research, but it showed that around 80% of managers never receive any sort of formal training in how to lead people. And I think given that managers shape so much of our experience at work, so Again, this is from research that around 70% of our experience at work is shaped by the manager that we have, whether that is a positive experience or a negative experience. I think it's really strong to say, like, managers are really important. And if we have a terrible boss, it may end up in us leaving or just hating the job or disengaging or whatever it might be. So I think, like, if I were to name one of the big ones, it would be that leadership side.
We're going to get into your thriving talent framework, which is like the bulk of the book. But I first wanted to talk about how organizations use traditional workplace interventions to solve some of these problems that we were talking about, like the busyness and leadership problems. How come these don't work? And what are some of the interventions that...
That was the section in the book I was really excited and interested to share, because I think there's so much wrong with this. And I come from this research background. So for 20 years, I worked in market research agencies, analyzing data and solving marketing and sales problems for global organizations. So I'm really into the data and like how you can match what problem we're trying to solve with how we're solving it. I think oftentimes we think we need an intervention, well-being intervention, leadership development, whatever that might be, whatever that looks like, and it might have different names but be the same thing. We decide we need that because it's popular, because the organization down the road, because something was recommended to us, because leadership told us to. And so we implement something without necessarily knowing why we're doing it. So again, it comes back to this idea of impact. But if we don't know why we're doing it, how are we going to measure whether that intervention was effective or whether it's going to meet what the underlying issue is? So if we're saying we have an engagement issue, okay, but what's driving that engagement issue? What's driving disengagement in our workforce specifically, rather than more generally in the workforce? So I think we need to really understand the specific things about what's happening in our own organization rather than trying to copy what's going on elsewhere. We need to understand how we can very specifically address those issues, and then how can we measure whether or not it has been effective. And I think we don't do any of those things right now. I don't know if you've seen any of this or heard any of this in your own experience, Brandon.
Yeah, I for sure have. And I wanted to hone in on one thing you mentioned in your book about like how you created the thriving talent framework. You'd mentioned that it came from some rough personal experiences. You described even sitting at your desk, watching managers walk into a meeting where you're told you'd be part of, or a colleague pulling you into a room to say, "I'm your boss now." How did moments like that shape this framework that we'll talk about in a second?
Yeah, really good point. And it's still painful. Like when I hear those stories, they were, a long time ago now, but it's still really frustrating. I think for me, so that was my first experience of not having a positive experience at work. Up to that point, I loved work. I was really ambitious. I always got on very well. And I had a couple of experiences like that. And it just made me question everything. So how could I have got myself into this situation? What should the leadership team be doing? And what should HR be doing as well? Because at that time as well, I've since learned, now that I'm kind of working a bit more in this industry, in my mind, it was HR's responsibility. But I can see now it's more like, how could leaders have supported me better to succeed in the role that I had? And so I suppose it came from that point of pain, and I started asking those questions. So that was the organization one. Separately, I worked in another organization where it wasn't so severe, but I just wasn't feeling fulfilled. I wasn't reaching my full potential in that role. And it went on for a number of years. And eventually I just left and was kind of seeking answers. And I went on and I did a master's in organizational behavior. And I asked one of my lecturers, I said, "These are the things that have happened to me at work. What's that about?" And she said, "Oh, that sounds like a fit issue." So I became obsessed with this idea of fit. What does it mean to fit in at work? And so, from all of the extensive research I did, I landed on this model that I wanted to test. And, essentially that's what later became the Thriving Talent framework. So I came up with this, that it's about values alignment, it's about need satisfaction, and it's about demands and abilities. So I've changed the language slightly on demands and abilities to talk more about our strengths and how we use our strengths at work. And the framework has evolved over time through conversations, through my own work with organizations as well. So, and the language has evolved just in line to make it that bit broader. And the process of writing the book and all of the research I did as part of that was really interesting as well, just in terms of broadening my perspective as to what needs to be included in all of these different areas. So do you want me to talk through
the please
model?
What are the core components of the Thriving Talent Framework?
Yeah. So for anyone who is listening today rather than watching, it's a foundation. So picture it like a temple. So we have the foundation, we have like a big block at the bottom for psychological safety. So that's feeling safe to speak up without fear of any repercussions. Amy Edmondson is huge in this area of research, and I've cited a lot of her work in this area. So starting with a base of psychological safety, because we need to have psychological safety in place to be able to execute across the three pillars. So then we have three pillars going across. So first pillar is workplace culture. I talk about positive workplace cultures, how leaders can shape culture, and how to address toxic work cultures, because let's face it, I don't think any of us intends to be in a toxic workplace culture or to create one. And so it's about, addressing that you may unintentionally be causing a toxic workplace culture. The second pillar is all about drivers, and this started out as needs and need satisfaction. So I do talk about some of the principles around need satisfaction, understanding what really drives us at work. I have a whole chapter on money as well, because I think it's important to address it, to talk about these things, to get these things out in the open. But there's also some things that are driving us internally, but actually could be derailing us in some way. So something like the need to be right all the time. Like that's an example I always think of. If you are the kind of person who's driven to be right or to have the last word, that may be impacting on your ability to do your job or to build solid relationships with your colleagues. So it's about being aware of these drivers that individuals have. The third pillar then is all about capabilities. And again, when I first started thinking about this, when I first started writing the chapter, I thought this is about our strengths at work. And as I did more research, it's beyond just individual strengths. It's looking at how do we leverage our strengths as an individual, first of all, because I don't think we do that at work. And I think so many people don't feel like they're realizing their potential through the work they do. So looking at individual strengths, but then looking at, well, how do we leverage that in a team through people who have complementary strengths, for example? And then how do we leverage that in an organization through learning, through, and Josh Bersin calls this learning in the flow of work. Mm-hmm. How do we leverage automations and AI to take some of that busy work away from us? But then also, what are some of the blockers that get in the way? And again, here I kind of expand on this idea of busyness and emails and lack of collaboration. What are the things that are taking up our time and taking that time away from our ability to get into, and again, I expand on this in the book, this idea of flow and deep work, and have time to actually focus on those really important areas. And then the capstone of the model. So you have psychological safety, culture, drivers, capabilities. And then the capstone of the model is leadership. And again, when I first wrote this chapter, I was very much focused on how do we lead other people, and got a note back from my publisher saying, it's a little bit flat compared to the rest of the book. It was the last chapter I wrote, and I probably had run out of a bit of steam at that stage. And I revisited the chapter and I said, right, what do I really want to say here? And so I could not understate the idea of what it takes to lead ourselves first. So growing in self-awareness, leading consciously, understanding how our emotions can trigger us and how we show up and how we can respond rather than react. And then thinking about, how do I want to show up as a leader? How can I learn from the leaders that I've had, whether that's a positive learning or something that I know that I don't want to do, and draw upon the the multiplier effect from Liz Wiseman as well, her idea of how do we have leaders who are multipliers rather than diminishers. And then I touch on this idea of followership as well, and how all good leaders are good followers. So it's definitely, there's lots to take in, but I think there's something there for everyone.
Yeah. What I love about your book is that, like, these are your ideas based on your experiences, but you are so well researched in this book. So you leverage other people's ideas and quotes and thoughts to support your own framework. And I want to start with psychological safety. There's a lot of good stuff in this section. Robert Glazer, who I've had on the podcast before, I think you had a conversation with him, and there was a good test for whether you have psychological safety in your workplace. And he said, ask your team to do something outrageous and see if they push back or just quietly comply. So beyond that, what are some everyday signals that tell a leader whether their team is actually safe or not?
Yeah, I think this was a real challenging one as well, because, and I did get a bit of pushback from my publisher to say, like, is that the only way that we can see? Because it seems a bit extreme, and it seems like you're kind of diminishing psychological safety a little bit if you're pushing your team too much. I think one of the key signals that we don't have psychological safety is silence. If people are not speaking up and sharing their ideas. And I think we can fall into this false sense of security, thinking that people they feel okay, they feel safe because they're not saying anything. But because silence is not visible. It's just people are not speaking. And, I think it's important to recognize that as a sign. And I think that's why when Robert Glazer talks about this, it is a surefire sign that if people are not pushing back, then you haven't created safety. Yeah. I had Amy Edmondson on the podcast as well, and we talked about, look, what does this actually mean, and whether or not psychological safety is the same as comfort. And I think a lot of people confuse feeling comfortable with feeling safe.
I agree.
When we have psychological safety, we can still feel really uncomfortable with having to say something, but we have the safety there that we know there's not going to be repercussions if we speak up and share what's on our mind. It might feel deeply uncomfortable, but it's still safe because something bad isn't going to happen to you as a result. You're just going to feel massively, massively uncomfortable. Another interesting thing that she talks about is the idea that the default is generally that we don't have psychological safety. So I think if we go in with the assumption that we haven't created psychological safety and address the elephant in the room. So say, listen, I'm not sure if we have psychological safety here, and start talking about it and start asking people, how do you think that we can create this? And I think the role as a leader is to start those conversations and to be a bit vulnerable and to say, it's, I never knew that we needed it, or I'd never heard of this before, but now I recognize the importance of creating this safe environment for us to be able to share ideas, to be able to push back, to be able to challenge how things are done. I think it's really important.
You reference Edgar Sheen's idea that leaders create culture often unintentionally. Their everyday actions say more than any culture deck ever could. So unpack what this looks like in practice. Like if our everyday behavior and actions create the culture unintentionally, either positive or negatively, what does this look like in every day?
Yeah. So one example I think about in this, so in an organization that I worked in, when I was doing my research, I always thought like culture is values. And as I understood more and more about that, and how on the one hand, we can have values that we say, but then we don't necessarily behave in that same way. So the values that we say we have are not in alignment of how people actually behave. And when I worked at this organization, one of the values was simple. But if I wanted to send an email to our local Irish clients in this global organization, I had to get approval from one of two people who were based in a different time zone. And probably, I can't remember, I can't even remember how things ended up. Did I wait, or I waited 2 weeks, or in the end, it would have been just quicker for me to send those emails or have everyone in the team send individual emails rather than wait the time for this approval. But so on the one hand, you're saying simple. That's one of our values. That's what we live by. That's how we expect things to be done. But it was the most bureaucratic organization I ever worked in. There was a lot of red tape. There was a lot of, there was a lot of stuff that you had to get, so many layers of approval just to send out an email. So that's just one solid example of how, when we say this is what we want our culture to be, and what the reality of what people actually experience through, whether that's through policies or whether it's through the behaviors of our team around us. So I think it's thinking about, and again, not going massively away from the values. I think that the values and the principles should be what guides us in our behavior, and a really clear understanding of what that actually looks like for us in the everyday, but making sure that that is the experience that people are having. So if we're saying we want to create an environment where people share ideas, and it's, innovation is one of the critical things for us to be able to succeed, but then when someone shares an idea, we shoot it down and say, well, we tried that already, or we some other way we diminish when people are trying to behave in a way that is reflective of what we say we want. So I hope I've explained that in a couple of different ways, but it's really about, like, what are we saying we want? And then what are the kind of behaviors that we're allowing in the organization as a leader? And then what are the behaviors we're witnessing as an employee?
You've always believed that people should leave toxic environments. I'm sure you've done that in the past. But then Zach Mercurio challenged you. He said that if everyone who cares leaves, no one's left to fix the culture. So what do we do? Like, how do we evaluate, like, honestly, like, what we should do, and should we stay and help be part of the solution, or like, what do we do in this case?
Yeah, like you say, so I left those couple of workplaces where I found it toxic, and I was in the lucky position financially that it didn't impact me that much leaving those workplaces. And I know not everyone is in that lucky position, so I think we need to look at it from a financial perspective. Do we actually have the financial means to leave, and even a runway of 6 months to a year of I won't say income, I won't say salary, but enough that we have to get by, to actually survive if we're looking for work during that time. Because I know, like, right now, at the time we're recording, things are kind of tough in the job market at the moment, I think globally. So just making sure that we have enough of that runway. But I think making the decision, it's a really personal thing. But I think for me, it's looking at, is this actually impacting on me? And are things changing? So if I'm making suggestions, let's assume, I think fair to assume, that no one wants to be in a toxic work environment. And one of the types of toxic work environments, and certainly I've been in this, is the us and them. And maybe if you're in the them, if you're in the kind of the other, and you feel like you're untouchable because you're part of the in crowd, then maybe things are okay for you and you don't need to leave, but you're not creating a great environment for the others. Let's say you are the person who wants to challenge how things are done, and to change and to address some of the toxicity and the toxic behaviors that are happening. I think if you start speaking up and nothing changes, then you can assume that things are not actually going to change. So if you're making suggestions and they're going pretty much nowhere, like it's falling on deaf ears, or they're trying something but it's really not working, or they're not trying hard enough, then, like, how much energy are you really willing to put into changing something, flogging a dead horse, let's say, like put into something that's not actually changing? I think for your own mental health and well-being, it's really important to get out there, because I know for me personally, it had an impact on so many different aspects of my life. I was working long hours. It impacted on my health. It impacted on my relationships. And one of the biggest lasting impacts it had on me was my confidence in my own abilities, because I blamed myself. I thought, I'm not good enough, or this, how did I get into this situation? And so my confidence was gone for years afterwards, in subsequent roles as well. Even getting that reassurance and things, it really had a big impact. So I think you have to think whether it's worth it for yourself personally, whether you stay in that kind of environment.
Dan Ariely's research shows that large performance bonuses actually decrease performance for cognitive tasks, which seems counterintuitive to me in some ways. But you make the case for emotional salary instead. Where do leaders get tripped up in using money as a motivator, and why do you argue that emotional salary should be used instead? And what is that?
Yeah, I think money is good to a degree, but most people are not motivated by money. We're motivated by
Hmm.
intrinsic factors. So money is an extrinsic factor. It comes externally to us. But at its heart, what really motivates us internally to get up and go to work every day, to get up out of bed in the morning, to be excited about work, are the internal needs and how we satisfy our internal needs. So I do love this idea that like pay people fairly,
Yeah.
pay people a certain amount, make sure that their pay is equitable as well, so that you're not paying some people more than others. And yes, there are some people who are driven by achievement and money, but I think that type of achievement only gets you so far. I think that those internal motivators that we all have, if you can tap into those, and I won't share like all of the different types of emotional salary, but I will talk a little bit about the needs that we have. So we all have universal needs for autonomy, relatedness, and competence. That means a sense of choice and control over what you do and how you do it. That's autonomy. Relatedness is feeling a sense of belonging or camaraderie with the people that you work with. And competence is feeling capable of doing your role. But we also have unique needs. So you may have a need for stability or variety or achievement or recognition. You may have something else that's really driving you. And if your leader can understand that and tap into what are those things that really drive you to do a better work, a better job. So for me, I love being recognized publicly for what it is that I'm doing. So if I'm working in an organization and someone calls out my name in a meeting and says, Aoife, you've done a brilliant job. Like that motivates me to want to continue doing a better job because I know if I keep doing a good job, I'm going to be recognized. For other people, that may look a little bit different. They may be motivated by having stability or like doing the same thing day in, day out. That's really motivating for some people, having that sense of I know what it is that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis and it doesn't change too much. In this day and age, it's hard to find those kind of roles. But I think if you can find the thing that really drives that internal need, that different people in the team, this is the other complication, is that different people will have different drivers and different levels of those drivers as well. But if we can tap into that and find what really motivates people, then the money kind of becomes almost a secondary factor. Like if you've ever heard someone say, I enjoy this so much, I do it for free. Like that's when you know you're onto a winner. It doesn't mean you don't pay people any money to do it. You pay them their worth, you pay them their value. But I think if we can tap into that kind of motivation, then people will go above and beyond. They will really bring their, not just their hands, but their head and their heart into the work that they do.
That's so well said. You referenced Tara McMullen's Eggbeater Effect. Technology is meant to save time, just raise expectations and create more work. You apply that directly to AI, and I'm seeing this in my work. So we're doing more with these tools, but we're still using the time, we're thinking of our normal workday, 8 hours, but we're just doing more. So what's the lesson or the warning for leaders in this scenario where we have all these amazing tools now and our people are doing more, but they're still doing the same amount of time?
I would, there's a couple of things that I want to pick up here. I'm a big fan of Tara McMullen, and I loved her article all about the Eggbeater. For me, so yeah, a couple of things. The first thing is this idea of, and I do this as well, now I have AI and AI can help me, and yet I still feel as busy as I did before. I think because it's able to do so much, becomes about discerning what that actually is. And because we think we can do more, we give it more, but we have to have some sort of human judgment and thinking around what it is that the AI produces. So it's not independently producing this stuff for us. We're getting it to produce more and more stuff, which actually gives us more stuff to do. I think in Tara's argument, it's more that these machines that we have in our life, they're there to save us time, but we actually just fill up that time with other
Yep.
stuff. The second point I wanted to make ties in with what I said earlier about this idea of impact and really understanding what is it that we're here for. And so we're moving away from this busy work and just churning out more and more stuff. And we're focusing on, why are we actually here? What impact is it we're trying to have? What reason does this organization exist beyond just profit? And how can we shape the work that we do on a day-to-day basis to have more of an impact on that whether it's the bottom line, the profit, like what's actually moving the needle, or that other impact that we have that is not related to profit. How do we do more of that work, and how do we cut out some of the stuff that we do?
Yeah.
So it's about removing some of the things that we're doing and focusing on just a few things. And again, when I say this out loud, this is a lesson for myself as well as everyone else who's listening. You know, I'm not immune to these things happening. I'm human as well. But it is about focusing on what are those things that are really going to have the impact, and saying no to the things that won't. I think that's the big changer, is not adding more and more stuff and getting more and more stuff done, which I think we feel if we do more, then we're somehow more valuable. But I think the value comes in discernment and judgment and focusing on what are the big things that we can put more effort into, rather than lots and lots of little things that make us feel busy.
It's so challenging because, like, I was joking with a colleague the other day about this. It's like, well, with this like new use case that I found with AI, I'm like able to do the work of like 5 different people, it feels. And so it feels good for me to just be able to do more and to achieve more business outcomes. But it's a trap, because it's like, as we get more and more efficient, it's like, when does it stop?
When does it actually end if we just keep adding more and more to our plate? And it could also be, Brandon, the law of diminishing returns. When does this stop being effective for you? Like, if you're using it to do the work of 5 people, where is the cutoff point to say, well, actually, how valuable is having that? And do I need to oversee that? Do I need to make some judgment here and say, well, that's a valuable use of time, or that's not, or we need that, or we don't need that? I think the temptation often is to do more stuff, and especially when, you know, the language that we're hearing is we have to do more with less. You know, how can we use that? But I think, how do we be a bit more discerning about what we actually are focusing on? And again, you know, speaking in the language of companies, it's like the things that move the dial, or the things that earn us more money, or are going to have a bigger impact on the bottom line, but also relating back to, well, what impact are we trying to have on the world? Why do we exist beyond money?
So, as you mentioned earlier, leadership is the capstone of your framework. It's not the foundation. Psychological safety is the foundation. And this is deliberate, right? You say that a leader's sole role should be developing their people, but I think that often clashes with the reality of day-to-day business. So for a leader caught between those two worlds, where do they start?
Yeah, it's a really valid question. I think I was asked a few years ago to speak on this idea of leadership. And one of the questions they asked me in preparation for speaking about this topic was, can you give us a definitive answer of how people should split their time between leadership and their day-to-day role? And, you know, I was like, how do I answer that question? To me, that is, how long is a piece of string? And having been a people leader myself, I know the responsibilities associated with it. I know the amount of admin that's associated with it. And I think it's really tough to balance that. I think as leaders, one of the most important steps that we can take is to empower the people around us, to empower our teams. I think sometimes we get caught in the trap of, I've been promoted because I'm so good at doing this day-to-day job, so I'm going to hold on to this as long as I can, when actually the most effective use is to achieve results through other people. Now, that's something I found really difficult when I first became a people leader, is delegating and allowing other people to actually take on a lot of the roles that you previously had. And so you're there to coach them, you're there to facilitate that, and to kind of take that step up. a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think that's one key step that we can take. As I mentioned earlier in the book, I talk about this idea of becoming a multiplier rather than a diminisher. So if you're focusing on multiplying the impact that other people have rather than diminishing, and I think a key way to do that is what I just talked about, is empowering your team to actually take on a lot of that work rather than holding on to it yourself. I think oftentimes we're guilty as leaders of being the bottleneck for other people being able to get their work done. So if you can empower them to make decisions, to not, they don't have to check in with you on everything. There's certain decisions they can just take themselves, and to take on a bit more of that work. I think that would make the biggest difference.
It's well said. Well, Aoife, there's so much more I wanted to cover with you, but we're out of time. I want to encourage people to go pick up the book. It's called Thriving Talent: How Great Leaders Drive Performance, Engagement, and Retention. Where is the best place to both connect with you and check out all of the awesome work, your podcast, and then get the book? Like, what do you want to share?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I'll share a few ways. So the first is to check out the book on thrivingtalentbook.com. And if you buy from my publisher directly, which you will be able to do through that website, there's a special discount code for listeners of the Transform Your Workplace podcast, which is Brandon. So all capitals, Brandon. Type that in, and you'll get a discount. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, where you can just click directly and get that discount for the Thriving Talent book. So that's thrivingtalentbook.com. And since you're listening to a podcast, then head on over wherever you're listening to this or watching, then check out Happier at Work, and you'll find a back catalogue of over 300 episodes at this stage. So I've been doing this for a long time, much like Brandon as well. And the third way that I'll share is on LinkedIn. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. If you want to connect with me there, feel free. And I'm sure we'll put a link below, but I'll spell out my name here just in case. So my name is Aoife O'Brien, and it's spelled Aoife. O'Brien is spelled the usual way. So Aoife O'Brien, and you'll find me on LinkedIn.
My guest today has been Aoife O'Brien, author of The Thriving Talent. Thanks for coming on. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Brandon. A real pleasure to chat with you today.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.